We're extremely fortunate to have Amy Rosenberg as our speaker today, and on the topic of Mediate This Stories About Power Disparity in the Workplace and Approaches to Mediating on an Uneven Playing Field. Amy Rosenberg worked as an attorney for 40 years before launching her mediation practice. Much of her legal work was devoted to litigation and protective proceedings, which are guardianships, conservatorships. Oh my goodness, sorry everybody. Contested wills, fiduciary fraud, testamentary capacity, and common law marriage. While practicing as an attorney, she served as a mediator and represented clients in the mediation process. She has completed multiple training programs that include facilitative and evaluative mediation models, and she volunteers her time to mediate a variety of civil disputes for the Small Claims Court of Larimer County, Colorado, and the Fort Collins, Colorado Neighborhood Mediation Initiative. She also participates in the Fort Collins Restorative Justice Program, which provides young offenders with opportunities to experience accountability and reparation. Amy, thank you so much for being here. I will pass it off to you.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here, and I hope this is useful to everybody. Um, Usually, I'm not talking to people about mediation. I'm in a mediation more than I'm talking to people about it. But I like talking about things that I believe in, and ADR is one of those things. And I want to thank Jason and Sarah for putting this together, and Lee for all of their help with the process and the technical end of things. So I have reached into my history of stories and fact patterns to give us a couple of situations to take a look at. They involve disputes in different workplaces and what I think are some interesting issues of power disparity. So in every mediation, there's going to be a narrative. I'm going to give you the mediator's narrative, which I hope will be mostly neutral and fact-based. But in every mediation, as you know, every participant is going to have his or her own story. And especially in workplace, there are going to be issues that surround power, authority, and conflict. And I distinguish power and authority because they're related, but obviously authority is power coupled with legitimacy. And that can become an issue. That can become an issue when we talk about power disparity and how we're going to approach mediation. In each of the fact patterns, there's going to be some difference in power and authority, but this is common. There's always going to be conflict in the workplace that's based on power disparity. But we need to look at sources of power and authority. They can be any of these things here: age, gender, experience, what your degree is in, relationships. Lots of that is involved in identifying sources of power and authority, and it may help inform our discussion of where we go with that. We're always going to have workplace power disparity. There will always need to be somebody who has ultimate authority. And you know about this because in the federal government, you have lots and lots of experience with levels of authority. You have branch chiefs, you have directors, you have deputy directors, you have assistant deputy directors, you have secretaries and undersecretaries. So there's a power structure. And one of the most interesting pieces about workplace mediation is the workplace absorbs so much of our lives and so many of our working hours. And if it's not a good place to be in because there's conflict, it really colors our attitude. And in my experience and by observation, I think workplace mediation involves dealing with people who can become very hostile very quickly because of their proximity. And it's a real art and a science to work on that situation in a way that will allow people who need to be in the same workplace to continue to get along. They have skills, they have institutional memory, and all of that's valuable to mission. So there's that. But let's get to a fact pattern. And this is going to be the problem with the plane. Now, this involves an airline that is no longer in operation. But when it was in operation, it was one of the heavy hitters in domestic and international airline work. So here's the story. The senior flight attendant, we're going to call her Patricia, has 25 years on the job with this airline. She is about to start the pre-flight safety information chat, but not yet. People are still boarding the plane, and they're going to go to Dallas. And she goes back to the back of the plane. There are two rear-mounted engines, and she's listening. And something doesn't sound right. On one side, it just doesn't sound right. So passengers are settling in. She goes forward and talks to the captain, Charles, and tells him that she thinks something's wrong. He tells her he's already done the walk around and everything checked out. She insists that he come back and listen to the engine. And he's annoyed, but he follows her. He listens. He tells her everything's fine. She's not a pilot, and she doesn't know what she's talking about. So passengers are now in their seats. It's time for the pre-flight safety briefing. So Patricia takes the intercom and makes the announcement, and she says, "Good morning, welcome aboard Flight XYZ Dallas. My name is Patricia, and I'm the senior flight attendant on today's crew. I've been a flight attendant for 25 years with this airline. I think we have a problem with one of our engines, and I will be exiting this aircraft, and I will not be accompanying you on this flight. Thank you." And with that, she removes her carry-on and walks down the jetway and into the terminal. Now, put yourself in Charles' position, but not for long, because every passenger is walking off the flight with her. Every single passenger followed her out the plane. Can Charles go out in the terminal and get her? Should he go after her? Should he get on the intercom and try to tell the passengers that nothing's wrong? Well, that would have been interesting, but everybody's already off the plane. When you hear that announcement, put yourself in the position of a passenger. Think for a few seconds. How are you going to respond to what Patricia has told you over the intercom? So the optics on this are terrible. This is really bad for the airline. And this is one of those cases where it's a workplace dispute, but it's happening in front of the customers. And that makes it particularly difficult, okay? Now that day, the plane was taken out of service and Patricia was fired immediately. She sues to get her job back. Now, in this situation, who has power? Well, Patricia had some power, and it's obvious that she had power. Charles had some power. He was supposed to have power, but somebody jumped the line. And who else had power? The passengers had power. They had the power to stop that flight, and they did. And they did. Now, Charles's source of power and authority are training, knowledge and experience, skill, permission. He has the airline's permission to do what he's doing, and title. There's a reason he's called the captain, because doesn't he have ultimate authority for what happens on the plane? You've heard of pilot error. Nobody's heard of flight attendant error. At least I haven't. So he has ultimate authority, but no way to exercise that power. That's a conflict. So let's talk about Patricia. She has less authority arguably, but she does have authority. Flight attendants have a lot of authority. If you interfere with a flight attendant, you're in serious trouble. She has knowledge, she has expertise, she has skill. She has no permission whatsoever, but she uses everything in her background to exercise power. So the captain has not so much power. Everything that looks like he's supposed to have power, they don't work here. Patricia has a lot of power, plus a willingness to act on her perceptions. So she has used that to introduce insecurity and uncertainty because she has a willingness to stand up to Charles and his ultimate authority. Passengers have no authority at all, but they have power by sheer numbers to stop the flight. And what the passenger would have said in this situation, if you had interviewed somebody getting off that flight, they would have said, I was scared. When she walked off the plane, I did too. Right. So what happens next? She gets fired. She sues for her job back. She wants her salary and the difference between what she's been able to make in another job without the benefits there. She wants some attorney's fees. And her union's going to back her up on this. So there's mediation. The narrative from the airline is Charles's narrative. Patricia's going to have her own narrative. So the airline's narrative is this: Patricia was wrong, and Charles is speaking for the airline. The airline is adopting his narrative. I did a walk around. I listened when Patricia asked me to. Everything was fine. I know these planes. I wouldn't have jeopardized my own life or anybody else's if I thought there was something wrong. We have to rely on the judgment of people with the most training, the most experience, and the most responsibility. We can't undercut pilots. It scared the passengers unnecessarily, and it made the airline look bad. Here's Patricia's narrative. I'm smart, I'm trained, I'm experienced, I know what I'm doing. Pilots need to listen to us. We're the ones who have to get passengers to safety in an emergency. I was using my best judgment to protect everybody on board, including Charles. I was fired for, what are the 3 words? I was fired for doing my job. It's always doing my job. That's how she sees her job. That's not how the airline sees her job. So there's a disparity in authority here. There's a pilot with ultimate authority versus a flight attendant with some authority. The airline has ultimate authority to fire her. She has some power to push back through her lawsuit and her union. There may be a disparity in expertise, but not a lot. We can ask ourselves, is culture or experience an issue? Does Charles have a history of being large and in charge? Does she have that same history? Is either accustomed to a lot of deference? There may be more balance and power than it initially looks like. And one of the things that we have to do is take people's issues. So Patricia's issues are, I want my job back, I want compensation, and I want respect. Her issues. I shouldn't be punished for pointing out a hazard. Charles' issue is insubordination, for lack of a better word. I need to be able to work with people who do their jobs. Her job was to stay on that plane and get everybody to Dallas. She messed up the flight, not me. So we take those issues and we go up from there and see if we can be a little more general, and in general, reframing this to get to a common interest. And what is the common interest? What do Patricia and the airline have in common? What do Patricia and Charles have in common. I really like the slide on the left. I did a fair amount of research about flight attendants and their authority and training and so forth, and I'm never gonna keep reading my book while the flight attendant is doing the pre-flight safety briefing. I will never do that again. But what do Patricia and the airline have in common? Remember Charles' narrative and remember her narrative. Here are the issues. Her issues are she stays in her lane. Her issues are Charles knew what he was doing. Charles did listen to her. But she's saying, I don't have to stand by and wring my hands if there's a safety issue. We're going to change we're going to change all of those issues to something that's overarching. And that's the safety of everybody on the plane, right? When Charles says she needs to stay in her lane, we rephrase that to everybody has expertise. When he says, I know what I was doing, every member of the crew is competent and trained. That's how we rephrase that. He did listen to her. He disagreed with her, but we changed that to she acted on her own initiative. Perhaps informed, perhaps not. She acted on her own initiative. Patricia's going to say, I don't have to stand by and wring my hands if there's a safety issue on the plane. We changed that to members of the flight crew should be proactive regarding safety. Charles needed to listen to me because it's important for the captain to be approachable by crew members. I shouldn't be fired for pointing out a problem. We changed that to my job is to take care of everybody on board and we need to encourage communication. So when we frame the interest, it's really kind of a single interest. It's safety. And so when we mediate this, we talk about the importance of skill everywhere, in every job. And if we do that, we're together. We figure out where everybody's interested. Everybody's interested in safety. Okay. There's also a recognition in framing these interests that somebody has to have ultimate authority. Charles is the face of the airline. The airline's responsible, but we put him in the hot seat. Okay. Patricia might say pilots are sometimes wrong. Charles might say flight attendants are sometimes wrong. But I'm going to bet in the mediation, they will express respect for each other. Because if she knows Charles, she knows he's a good pilot. He's not cavalier. I'm hoping that. He knows that Patricia isn't a wild card. He's worked with her before. We emphasize the importance of everybody's contribution, including alerting the captain to a hazard. In the photo on the right, that's the famous US Air flight that landed in Hudson. When you're that close to a disaster, I can't imagine Charles saying to a flight attendant, you get the people off the plane. I'm gonna go bring my bag. Sullenberger didn't do that. He became a flight attendant, getting people off the plane. Certainty and security for passengers. That's an interest, not an issue. Certainty and security for passengers doesn't happen when a flight attendant walks off the plane. So let's, in the mediation, talk about, tell me more about your sense that that was the only option, because it might have been her only option. And what happens is that leads us to a discussion about what if this happens again? What should the options be? And as we encourage everybody's contribution, is there a way to resolve this pre-flight conflict between the pilot and the flight attendant that Charles and Patricia had? I don't know, because I don't know anything about airplanes. I don't know if you can have a procedure where you call a mechanic out and have somebody from maintenance check something, verify it. I don't know. But if you're working through this mediation, one of the things that we do in mediation is try to figure out a fix for something that allows us to go forward better next time. And this is going to be an interesting place for that, because I'm thinking that everybody in this mediation is really smart and they may have some ideas. By the way, there's a really good book called Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell. And in that book, there's a chapter called The Ethnic Theory of Plane Crashes. And this is about Korean Air that had several fatal crashes. And the recording devices provided information about first officers and co-pilots trying to politely tell the captain that the captain needed to do something else. There was a problem with weather, there was a problem with altitude, and the captain felt emboldened to simply ignore them. The captain ignored them and the planes crashed. And part of the problems was that captains had a history of punching or slapping or cursing their subordinates in the cockpit and ignoring their advice. And so nobody felt secure pointing out a problem that was going to cost people their lives. And Korean Airlines did it right. They went outside their own organization and had some other airlines, including I think one or two from the United States, to look at the situation. And not only did they fix their own problem, the other airlines who investigated the situation figured out their problems, identified some problems in their own carriers, and did some work toward remediating that and making the cockpit more amenable to listening. So what we want to do is we want to encourage everybody's contribution. And the mediation may not be the place for overarching change, but it may be a start. So what are some other things that we're going to deal with in the mediation? One is, does Patricia get her job back? If she doesn't, what does that say to other flight attendants? Is there going to be a chilling effect on their willingness to speak up and say something? What does it say to the public? So one of the issues that will come up here, if we want to encourage better communication between flight attendants and captains, ultimately for safety, can we do that? Will this mediation help produce that? Taking her out of a job, I don't think is gonna be good for optics. If I were the mediator, I would be keenly aware of that. I don't know how evaluative I'd become, but I would think it would be in the airline's best interest, maybe to put Patricia back. Did she find a substitute job? Yeah, there's going to be the issue of damages. Attorney's fees, I'm not worried so much. She's got some help from her union. The airline has counsel, clearly. A court may not award attorney's fees and costs unless a court finds that the airline's behavior was egregious. I don't know if a court's going to find it was egregious. Some of that depends on what we think might be going on in court if we can't mediate this. In real life, we'd be asking, how far has discovery gone? What do we know? What do we know about the aircraft? In real life, so I'm going to tell you this because this was something that kind of blew my mind. In real life, the litigation was paused for mediation during discovery. And Patricia's attorneys had subpoenaed the maintenance records for this aircraft. And the airline's response was, we can't find any of them. There was not a single maintenance record on that aircraft that the airline could turn over in discovery. So in litigation, if you've been asked for something that you should have and that's discoverable, and this is discoverable information, and that you should turn over, a judge or a jury can infer that if you had the information and didn't turn it over, that it works against your case. So they could indulge an inference against the airline. And they could make an inference that there was in fact something wrong with the plane and that Patricia was unjustly fired. So in real life, here's what happened. Patricia was fired, she sued, she got her job back, and she got some damages. I don't know if the settlement resulted in any kind of procedure going forward that would address the situation if somebody in the cockpit and somebody else in the flight crew had a concern. If somebody goes to the captain and does this again, don't know. It would be interesting to know that. Sometimes attorney's fees become an issue of negotiation, but I don't know if they did in the real life scenario. But she did get her job back, and stayed with the airline another couple of years till she was vested for all of her retirement benefits, and then she retired. So that's that one. But I think this is interesting because of the public nature of the dispute. This happened in full view of the airline's customers, and it cannot have been positive. So the airline had some reputational issues to deal with. But wait, there's more. Very different workplace, lots of privacy, lots of non-disclosures. A hospital is and should be a very private place for as public as it is. So I'm going to give you the mediator's narrative. Andrea is one of several in-house attorneys for a major medical center. We'll call it Hospital A. It's in a large Midwestern city. It's part of a large and highly accepted network of hospitals, laboratories, rehabilitation clinics, and medical practices. She works at the Office of Legal Affairs at the flagship hospital of the system, which has more than 900 beds. This hospital has the busiest emergency department by patient visit annually in the entire state. She has 2 levels of supervisory attorneys. Everybody ultimately reports to Martin. He's general counsel for the hospital system. Martin serves at the pleasure of the board of directors, and most of the staff attorneys have never met him. He does bond counsel and lobbying and that kinds of stuff. But he doesn't get into the nitty-gritty of the legal affairs of the hospital. So Andrea is the most recently hired attorney. Everybody she works with likes her. She's energetic, she's smart, she's proactive, she's a quick study. She is in her office. One of her supervisors is on vacation and cannot be reached, and by cell phone or email. The other is out of the office temporarily to attend a funeral. But Andrea is at her desk. Hospital administration calls Andrea on behalf of the postpartum unit. We have a 32-year-old patient who had a baby yesterday and just suffered a massive stroke. She has no written medical directive. The hospital, per state law and institutional practice, has relied and may rely on her husband for medical consents and can share information with him at any point. Staff can't reach him right now. He's not answering his phone. The patient hasn't identified another emergency contact. Hospital B is 11.5 miles from Hospital A. Hospital B has implemented an investigational protocol for stroke patients. When it is implemented, it has the capacity to prevent severe brain damage in the patient. Hospital A has approved this investigational protocol, but hasn't yet implemented it. Staff at Hospital A can treat the patient for a stroke using conventional protocols, and that's standard of care. It's standard of care for the hospital. But the patient's doctor and the rest of the people on the postpartum unit want to send her to Hospital B on the chance that she can have the investigational protocol and save so much of her functioning. Remember, she's 32 years old. The investigational protocol has to be implemented within 1 hour from when the patient suffered a stroke. A recent court case in the state imposed large sanctions against a hospital that transferred a patient to another facility without the consent of the patient or the patient's legal representative. Hospital policy is clear. Once admitted, a patient can't be transferred without proper authorization of the patient or the legal representative as long as the patient can be treated according to the applicable standard of care. So there you go. Legally, consent to treatment is implied in an emergency, but not necessarily consent to transfer. Hospital A will be protected if it keeps the patient and treats her with the standard protocol. If the ambulance has an accident on the way to Hospital B or there's a delay and the patient doesn't get the standard treatment in the meantime, the patient has grounds for a malpractice action. We have 50 minutes now. Hospital B is assembling a team and standing by. I am asked, can we send her to Hospital B? Andrea's asked, can I send her to Hospital B? Andrea knows about the court case. She says yes. Keep trying to find her husband, but get her over there. Staff says, who's authorizing this? In real life, it's doctors who admit and discharge patients. And in this case, Andrea says, I'm authorizing it. Who doesn't want to be on the hook? Her attending physician doesn't want to be. So she authorizes it. And when her supervising attorney returns, Andrea tells her what she has done. And the supervising attorney blanches and says, of course. Now, because this incident occurred outside hospital regulations and could have legal implications for the hospital, Andrea has to file an incident report with risk management and the Office of General Counsel, Martin. Martin reads the report, calls Andrea into his office, and purports to fire her. Andrea says she's entitled to a hearing, and she notifies Martin and the CEO of the hospital and the board of directors of her demand for hearing and pre-hearing mediation. She's entitled to that. Andrea is temporarily reinstated during mediation. So, pending mediation. So put yourself in Andrea's position. What does she see her job as ultimately? To protect the patient. What's your response to the attempted firing? She's gonna oppose it on grounds that this was not an act of insubordination. It was an act to provide care for the patient. And put yourself in Martin's position. His job is to protect the hospital from lawsuits because lawsuits are pernicious. They can suck the lifeblood out of a medical institution. If he makes sure that hospital operations follow the law and provide standard of care, he's protecting the hospital. So what's your response to what Andrea said? We can't have attorneys running around violating policy and clear directives in case law. So in this situation, who has power in terms of the transfer? Well, looks like Andrea has some power because, like Patricia, she was willing to do this. She has a job title, she has legal education, she knows the law, she knows the regs, she knows the consequences of the violation policy, and she was willing to stand when medical staff deferred to her. That's all sources of power. What is her authority? None. I would argue she has no authority to do this. The hospital has power. It acts through its doctors and employees. It has the power to put the patient into the ambulance and send it to hospital B. Some doctor could have had the power to do that, but the doctor didn't want to exercise that authority, that power. Hospital's authority on the transfer, any real authority? Arguably no. But we'll see. The hospital has authority in any case to terminate an employee's job for insubordination, violation of hospital regulations. Martin is the face of the hospital when he purports to fire Andrea. Andrea is going to argue that she was acting in the best interest of the patient and therefore the hospital, and that she's paying for it. Okay. Her narrative is, I would rather have the hospital sued for saving a patient's life or preserving functional capacity than letting a patient become a vegetable because we didn't have a treatment available for her and we wouldn't go to bat for her when things got critical. Every rule requires exceptions. I acted at the request of and with information from medical experts for this patient who wanted to save her. I would rather be fired than safe. Somebody had to stick their neck out for the patient. I did it. My career is being threatened because I was, 3 words, doing my job. Martin's main work with the hospital is to meet with bond counsel, forge affiliation agreements with colleges and universities, represent the hospital in front of the legislature. He's not tasked with staying up on statutes and case law. We brief him so that he can talk to the board of directors about what's going on, but he made a bad call. Okay, that's Andrew's narrative. This is Martin's narrative speaking as general counsel. Andrew's job is not to substitute her judgment for law and policy that have been put together dispassionately, carefully, and painstakingly, and after intelligent debate. This hospital is successful, and we're able to serve our community in no small part because we have useful rules and standard operating procedures. It doesn't help us to make changes on the fly. That's where patients, doctors, and staff get into trouble. The fact that we get lucky and nobody sues us when sometimes we go outside the law and regulations doesn't justify this transfer without authority. We can't have a no harm, no foul attitude, even if we're not sued. The transfer rule is in place to preserve patient autonomy and predictability and to keep us from getting sued. I'm not saying she should be fired for the sake of being fired or to make her an example, but we can't have this going on. I'm a big picture kind of guy, and this is how I see it, right? The disparity in authority at mediation. Hospital has lots of money for lawyers and ultimate authority for treatment of a patient versus an attorney who acted without authority. She's got to hire her own counsel. Hospital has authority to fire. The hospital trusts Martin. He's kept the hospital out of a lot of litigation. The hospital doesn't want to have to train another attorney. The cost of turnover is large. Again, is culture and experience or experience an issue here? Does Andrea feel pressured by the doctors who wanted to transfer the patient? Theoretically, the doctors could have done it, but they didn't. Is there a reason they went to Andrea? Is gender an issue here? Are there any other women staff attorneys at her level? Is the CEO or the general counsel historically hands-on or more deferential? And remember, there's a difference between general counsel and the chief executive officer. Does lengthy tenure of the general counsel or CEO make them more believable, less flexible? Do the attorneys have a history, especially this one in her short tenure? Does she have a history of doing ends around regulations? How often does this sort of transfer need to happen? How do the CEO and the board see this? So the issues for Andrea are she wants to keep her job. She wants security against being put in this position again. What does that security look like? That's going to be one of the things we talk about in mediation. What are the issues for Martin? He wants to fire her because she is insubordinate. She committed an act of insubordination. That means she is insubordinate. She didn't follow an important rule. She exposed the system to huge liability. If this goes well for the 32-year-old patient, wonderful. But if it goes badly for the 32-year-old patient, if she doesn't get treated for the stroke conventionally, and we lose time getting her to another hospital, and maybe the protocol doesn't work, or there's a delay and we're outside the golden hour. If she's a 32-year-old woman who lives for multiple decades, that is going to be a crushing financial load for the hospital to cover, even though it's got insurance. Hospitals often are self-insured up to a certain level, but it's going to be a huge expense for the hospital. So how do we reframe to get the issues to a common interest? I think what we talk about is protecting the health and safety of patients. Andrea is going to say, don't make me sit here and watch a patient decompensate. We're going to change that to, we need to ensure patients have access to what they need. When Andrea says, I understand about rules and regs, sometimes we just have to be able to go with what we've got. We're going to change that to, we respect a framework that provides a solid, predictable approach to patient welfare. And when rules are silent or objectively unsuitable to a given situation, we have to act professionally and in good faith. Martin's narrative. He says everybody needs to know the rules and abide by them. There's a procedure manual. Everybody's familiar with it. We're going to change that to, we want to make sure that good, workable, familiar policies are in place for the benefit of patients, medical professionals and staff. Martin's going to say we need to eliminate haphazard behaviors. And we're going to change that to familiarity and working consistently with good policies are going to give us good results all the way around. So if the attorney keeps her job, and I'm going to say she keeps it because she's good at what she does, but what we want the workplace to look like is a place where we have solutions to situations like this. I mean, if Andrea doesn't keep her job, the chilling effect, of course, is going to be an issue. But if she does, if this can come up again, and it can come up again, we need to be proactive going forward with a positive plan for dealing with this. Can Andrea be assigned to work on that with the hospital? With malpractice carrier, with risk management staff? Can we craft a regulation that works in light of the current case law? Martin, the CEO, and the board of directors may not be aware of whether there have been successful legal challenges to that recent case in favor of the emergency transfer. There may be more information out there that we're not aware of. And can the hospital, again, getting Andrea involved, can we get the hospitals through their associations? Can we come up with useful policies to create a standard of care that can help protect the facilities if they need to do this? And do we need to talk to the legislature about safe harbor statutes? There's a lot of policy involved in this one. And a lot of room to create some stability and some clarity, kind of like the airline, perhaps. In real life, what happened was the attorney was not fired. She was not threatened with firing. Her superior said, okay. And once this had worked its way through the system, after about 10 minutes, postpartum called and said, we found her husband. He said, thank God you sent her to hospital B. Call them and tell them I'm good with it and I'm on my way. So we don't know what happened to the patient, but the outcome for Hospital A and Andrea's staff attorney were not negative in any sense. And you know that Andrea was heaving a sigh of relief when they called and said, we found her husband. So there you go. Those are the fact patterns, and those are kind of the issues as I see them in mediation, and then the interests as I see them in mediation. And if you've got questions or discussion points, this is a great time to address those, I think. No?
Oh,
I
yes,
think
we have
I I think
plenty.
so. We have lots and lots of comments and questions and thoughts
Perfect.
and yeah, lots of engagement here. Um, I'll jump in with the first question. I think this one was first about Patricia and Charles, but I think it could apply to both. And I think it applies to a lot of us federal employees, you know, thinking about the importance of safety, the importance of security, and the importance of, you know, thinking about the Charles and Patricia scenario with a sort of in a with a DOE context and like a nuclear security context, like it gets very scary very quickly, right? Um, but does Patricia have a responsibility to try to escalate the matter above Charles before she takes it right to the public, before she takes it right to the passengers? Does she have, if Charles isn't listening to me, but I really feel that there's a problem here, is there another step that she should have taken before before the step that she did?
I don't know enough about airline protocol to know whether that's possible. They're on very tight schedules, tighter now than ever, I guess. I don't know, and I would love. Oh, somebody said she would have had enough time. There would have been enough time. So um, and this might because this happened some years ago. I don't know. I just communications are better now than ever. But oh, she could have contacted the local FAA rep. Okay, okay. I don't know how long that would have taken, but yeah, there may have been. I'm thinking the same thing as you. Not sure she would have had time. Yeah, it's this is a real crucible. Both of these were like really short term kinds of things. They were very immediate, and I don't know. One of the things that one of the things that if I were the mediator, I would not have said, why did you do that? I would have said, did you feel that there were other avenues available potentially? And thinking about it, she might have said, yeah, I could have done A or B, or no, there was nobody to call. And so everybody who's been weighing in on this, so this makes me think that maybe having something available if there's a conflict here. I mean, my gosh, you don't want to be arguing in front of your customers, like you don't want people arguing in front of patients in a hospital either. Um, but but to but to have that settled for you in advance, like what's going to happen. Um, Yeah, the accelerated time frame. It sure does. Yeah, it makes the consequences more dire, the
Certainly.
consequences of the dispute. I mean, if they were arguing downstairs at the ambulance bay about whether to take the 32-year-old patient over to hospital B and going back and forth, um, that's not going to be productive either. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, Amy,
go for it.
Um, okay, yeah, I was gonna say, there were other comments on this particular one that you were sharing. People are saying things like, how did the captain know that something didn't change since the engines were inspected? There could have been fog on the tarmac, which is a foreign object and debris, I believe, debris that could have been sucked into the engine, right?
Right.
And I know we have a lot of these questions of, well, how did they know there wasn't something wrong? And I know you talked a little bit about this, and I know, and if you can't answer, there were some questions about the specificity of this case, like how long ago it occurred, and if they found anything wrong with the engine after the plane was grounded. So I know you kind of sort of mentioned it a little bit, but do you care to go into more detail?
I don't know if they found anything. Of course, they lost all the maintenance records in real life. So we don't know, but I have a feeling that helped Patricia get her job back. I mean, that as somebody who used to do a lot of litigation, if you don't hand over records that we know you keep in the ordinary course of business, it says nothing good about you. I don't know. I think maybe taking the plane out of service after all the passengers had walked off was a good idea. Clearly, that was a good thing. Um, Somebody had to round up a new plane, and this was not without its consequences. But yes, my understanding was that the plane was taken out of service and inspections occurred. But I don't know what happened. And of course, Patricia didn't either. Patricia and her attorneys didn't know either.
I think Jason
Everybody
has
has
a
such good
follow-up
comments.
on that one.
Well, because everybody's flown and nobody likes being uncomfortable in an aircraft.
No, definitely. I mean, I guess to that point, how much do outcomes matter in these kinds of things? You know, with both of these, you know, the concerns are definitely legitimate no matter what. But like, if there's nothing wrong with the plane, does that make uh, Patricia's sort of concern less legitimate? If
Well,
the
and
patient,
it's a hindsight thing.
yeah.
If she had, if we knew she was correct, or if we knew she was incorrect, I think if she had been incorrect and we knew it, I think the airline would have been happy to make that public, would have been happy to find the records.
Mhm.
But you know, if somebody sees something, and I mean, the passengers had so much power, and we want to give passengers power too. It's important. Oh, somebody's citing Code of Federal Regulation. I love that.
I love it.
CFR, sorry. Um, I mean, we want passengers. We want passengers to be aware. I mean, with the attacks on flight attendants, we want passengers to intervene. We want to empower passengers. And I mean, there's a famous case where Alaska Airlines, not Alaska Airlines, um, uh, this was, I don't remember which airline it was. It was Aloha Airlines. That's what it was. Aloha Airlines had a plane that was doing island hopping, you know, up and down and up and down, Hilo to Honolulu, 30-minute flights, cruising altitude of 24,000 feet. And there was the Aloha Airlines flight that was on its way to either Hilo or Honolulu, and the top 18 feet of the aircraft peeled away right behind the cockpit. There was this instantaneous and massive decompression. And the flight attendant who was serving snacks from the aisle was sucked out over the ocean. Her body was never recovered. The pilot and the first officer managed to land the plane, but 18 feet of the top of the plane was gone. One of the passengers who was interviewed when the accident was being investigated said, "Oh, I noticed a crack on the side of the plane, but I didn't say anything to anybody." And that just gives me goosebumps. We want, yes, when you see something, say something, or when you hear something, say something. And there's probably a way to do that. There's probably a way to get a safety check short of just saying, I'm not going to fly to Dallas with you. I do think the point about something being sucked into the engine before you take off, after the walk around, after the final inspection, it certainly can happen. So
There are some follow-on comments that are really interesting, particularly with what you just said. You know, there was a little bit of brief discussion on things, people saying cultural differences with questioning authority. You know, there's a comment about the plane, like saying maybe not sure that safety was particularly the underlying issue. Maybe the captain was trying to save face as the leader expert or not valuing her expertise. There are other comments. where they say, yeah, speaking up can be problematic in certain cultures and stuff like that. Do you think any of that was at play? Because I know at some point you brought up in one of these cases, right, about gender, about just the traditional power of the captain versus the flight attendant, et cetera.
It,
So,
there,
what
there
what are
might
your
have
thoughts on that?
been, there might have been, I try not to prejudge that, but it certainly can inform what's happening. And Malcolm Gladwell's analysis of what was going on with pilots slapping and punching and cursing the other members of the crew in the cockpit, um, that was on some level, I think, uh, perhaps cultural. There was a lot of deference to authority, but they changed it. I mean, the good news there is that all of that can be overcome if we're looking at everybody's interest. And it can take a while to get out of that. I had a mediation exercise some years ago where we were dealing with a woman who had pushed back against her supervisor on taking deposits to the bank. It wasn't part of her job description. She was asked to do it for a week or two while somebody was out, but she didn't feel comfortable taking large amounts of cash to the bank by herself. And when I was the mediator in that one, I had them in the room together. And one of the things in her critique, and it was useful for me, she said, I am a small female from the Philippines. And she said, in my culture, it is very, very difficult to push back against authority. And it was not appropriate for me to be in the same room as my supervisor. For her, from a gender and culture standpoint, and even from a size standpoint. And she said, you should have had us in separate rooms. And so while I don't prejudge that situation, it taught me a lot about understanding where individuals in the mediation are and how they're going to process some of that.
Mm.
Mutual respect between yes, mutual respect. And see, that's what I think Charles and Patricia, if you got them into that mediation, they would probably say something nice about the other person. And I'm always a little encouraged when that happens, when they give a nod to somebody's skill or experience, or yes, he handled something marvelously for me, or yes, she really took care of a difficult situation on a different flight. And that's important. That's really important. And I hope that was part of the mediation process there. I suspect at some point they were able to come to that.
Yeah. Sort of on the point of sort of the cultural, not necessarily like the culture of the people, but the culture of the workplace. It seems to me, and this is more of a comment that's just coming off the top of my head, not something that was in the chat. Sorry, chat. But it seems to me that even if Charles was certain that there was nothing wrong with the plane, he had an obligation to Patricia and to the culture of the workplace to encourage people to bring these kinds of problems to his attention as a supervisor. So,
Yes.
and to show that he treated these kinds of things seriously. Yes, it's going to delay our tight timeline, but the whole system requires us all to be on guard all the time and all to be comfortable bringing things to me as the supervisor, as the person with the power and authority. And the fact that he brushed her off is more concerning to me, is the most concerning to me about that story.
Well, and when you're in mediation and you ask her to give her narrative, excuse me, she's going to say, You didn't hear me.
And you know,
Wasn't
it,
listening.
yeah, it's interesting because there's also something like I know somebody mentioned that they have family in the medical field when you just before you went into the story in the on the medical side, and this makes me wonder about the other factors that it could, the story as we're told, of course, it makes a lot of sense. Well, why didn't this happen? Why didn't this happen? But for the people that I know in the medical field, for example, kind of trying to relate to potentially Charles and what might have been going on, I wonder how much of that, right? There's a lot of that, gosh, like alert fatigue in the medical field. I'm curious how many times Charles has had, these warning lights or something like that, and they turn out to be nothing. And then it's that whole social experiment of, well, is this the one that we should pay attention to? And at the same time, with Patricia speaking up and not having done this before, it makes me wonder about all the other things that might have been going on the captain's side that could have appeared differently. Not that it changes the outcome, but that does lead to the next question of, to what extent do the outcomes matter in these cases? For example, if the plane did have an engine problem or the patient did survive, right? Does how to what extent does that matter, do you think, in these stories?
Well, I think the fear of the bad result is huge. And in the case of the hospital, um, hospitals see a lot of worst case scenarios, and they don't like being sued. I think the fact that the patient was okay, or I'm not real sure what happened to the patient after that, but the fact that in real life, the husband was able to say, okay, he consented on her behalf. And the fact that that was the good outcome from the hospital, like we have authority to do this. We're not just winging it. We've got authority because they were able to find him. That made it okay that one time. And people can feel comfortable about that. I think the most important part of that story going forward is how do we deal with this? Because it's going to happen again. Because these are big hospitals. They're doing investigational treatments all the time. They've got clinical trials going on all the time. But a clinical trial, you have time to sign consents for. And it was the transfer issue. I think for the hospital, if this had gone badly, Andrea probably would have been fired. And everybody would have said, yeah, she screwed it up. She just missed it. And with the airline case, I think the fact that we don't know what happened with the airplane because we don't have maintenance records. I think that supports Patricia's case. If there had been nothing wrong with it, if I were representing Patricia, I would have said she still had the right to call this to the captain's attention and to be heard. That would be my argument to the airline. And it's one that the airline doesn't have to buy in a particular case, but they should buy in terms of going forward, I think. Now I'm getting evaluative.
It's okay to get evaluative. We're all working in hypotheticals here. I think evaluative is good in these situations to chew on the hypotheticals. We've got a lot of great questions about the tension in both of these scenarios. I think between what appears to be sort of the reputational harm of the airline, of the pilot, of the hospital, of the CEO of the hospital. What's best for the airline isn't always what's best for the customer. And how do you, as a neutral, sort of weigh what's important there? I mean, obviously, when lives are at stake, it's hard to put anything above lives. But when you're talking about reputational harm, you're talking about making the department look bad when you're talk about making sort of whatever it is, especially in an era. Kimberly brought up age of social media, when anything can go viral at any time, and any of this can get out. I'm sure if this had happened now, somebody would have had their camera out while Patricia is making this announcement, and that absolutely goes viral on social media. So how do we balance those things, especially when maybe lives aren't on the line?
When lives aren't or are.
I mean, both. Both. Yeah.
That's one of the reasons so many, excuse me, so many lawsuit settlements are confidential. We don't, and normally when you have settlements, at least the way I have drafted them, is we typically don't admit fault. We just say the following things occurred. And then in order to avoid the risk and uncertainty of litigation, the parties agree as follows. And there's no blame ascribed, there's no guilt, none of that. But reputation is enormously important. It's image is so huge. And for this airline, they don't want to be seen as slipshod, unprepared. That's why the mediation is such a good place to address policy going forward. And if we want the reputation of the airline to be good or the hospital to be good, it has to be good before it looks good. And as a mediator, I would probably take the position of, if we do it right, if we have good processes and we're professionals, reputation will take care of itself. We want to avoid being dragged through the court of public opinion. But I would say for the hospital, which has an excellent reputation, you keep that reputation by doing what's best for the patient. And we need to make sure that that's predictable. For the airline, you need to do what's best for everybody on board. How do we make that more predictable? And that's how I would approach it in mediation. And within that, of course, there's a lot of detail, like how do we craft this procedure? Who crafts it? Who gets to be involved? How is it going to be reviewed? That's something that can be worked out. But I think framing the interest of passenger and crew safety and the interest of patient welfare, if we agree that those are the overarching concerns, we can usually find ways to make that happen. And I'm stunned at the creativity that people bring to mediation. It's amazing to me. It's stuff I never would have thought of, something that a judge would never. But I think you just have to just go way up high and say, okay, what's the ultimate goal here? And then break it down and how you get there. What does that look like?
Well, on that note, can you explain perhaps, and I don't know, because, right, when we come in and mediate something, we don't necessarily follow the case years and years after. but curious what your thoughts are in situations like these when there have been high stakes calls that have needed to be made or decisions that, and then in hindsight, everybody comes back and they're discussing these things. So, like, what do you think are the long term impacts or like the long term effects of mediation in that sense? Do you see like that ongoing relationships that have been repaired in mediation continue to be repaired, or anything you feel you'd like to address there?
I think a lot of it revolves around policy. Um, in in the neighborhood mediation for the city of Fort Collins, there are lots of barking dog cases, lots of barking dog cases. And the thing that ultimately settles them is is having an agreement between the offended neighbor and the dog's owner for the neighbor to let the owner know that the dog is a problem, and for the owner of the dog to agree to certain steps to resolve the barking issue. Like, we don't leave the dog out for more than this period of time.
Mhm.
We use a bark collar. We leave the dog indoors, something like that. And that, on an individual neighbor to neighbor issue, is what gets it settled. It's what will get this settled for the hospital. It's what will get this settled for the airline. Um, and in all of the barking dog cases, the person who makes the complaint never tells the owner of the dog. That I've never had a barking dog case where the person who's complaining goes to the neighbor directly and says, "This is a problem." That's that's also an issue. It became an issue when the neighbor who doesn't own the dog got to the end of his or her rope and decided to do it. This is kind of what happened in these scenarios. Um, the flight attendant perceived that she had no more rope. The attorney perceived she had no more rope. And we create a longer rope by creating policy and then adjusting that policy to make it work on an ongoing basis. Does that make sense?
Mhm. Yeah, and kind of on that point, there's been a lot of talk in the chat about stop work policies, knock it off policies, where if somebody senses something might be wrong, there's a policy in place that allows them to secure that safety issue and to make sure that whatever's happening stops, so that that safety can be assured, and the importance of sort of preparing for these kinds of moments with your explicit policies.
And if it's somebody who abuses the process, it should be pretty easy to track,
Mhm.
because if you have somebody who's crying wolf all the time, that person may need to be transferred to something else.
Yeah. Well, I think we have one more really great question I'd love to hear you address too, and that's from Isabella. Thank you, Isabella. How do we deal with overcoming power issues when it's not something as clear cut as safety? When maybe it's something more, I certainly love these hypotheticals because the stakes are so high, but when the stakes are lower, but there's still a dramatic power disparity issue, how do we overcome those power issues in a forum like a mediation?
Again, with allowing the mediation to provide a forum for people to discuss what the problem is and to say, "I don't feel that I'm making headway," and encouraging the policy change. I go back to the gal who didn't want to make the bank deposits because she felt fearful. And her supervisor wanted her to do it because she was told to do it. And so when you go up a level and you're saying, okay, our interest is having a profitable business and making it work well, valuing everybody's contribution, how can we make people feel comfortable? And then we look at the options of, is somebody else more comfortable taking the bank deposits? Is somebody else better at this particular job? Can this person be moved into a situation where we're using his or her skills better? It doesn't have to be life-threatening kinds of things. I think what's most important in the lower stakes mediation is giving everybody, as elsewhere, an opportunity to tell their story, what they want to accomplish, and how it would look. We want to make sure the bank deposits get to the bank every day. But if I'm uncomfortable about this, how does it look if we accomplish this with somebody else or something else? Or do we need to change this so that we take less cash? If what you're looking at is ultimately the success of small business, I think that's what you're doing. We're still going up to that 35,000 level look and saying, okay, the supervisor needs to be aware of how his or her attitude is affecting this person. And let's make this person not accountable here. Let's move this person somewhere else. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it really does. And we are kind of creeping toward the end of our time here, and I want to just first of all thank you so much for taking the time. I know Jason and I were so excited for this when we were telling everybody, talking about the stories that you have to tell, and just the real life stakes of it all, the complication, the complexities of what goes into the decisions, and considering these power disparities. Hopefully everybody here is able to consider this in the future, whether you're on either side of the potential power disparity, and how that can impact the type of communication you have, whether we're shutting things down, opening things up. So we are so grateful for your time and energy today. And thank you all for attending. If you, again, would like to be part of our distribution list, Amy's discussion here today will be posted in a little bit. So if you want that notification via the distribution list so that you can send it to others, feel free to send us an email at adroffice@hq.doe.gov, which is now in the chat. Thank you, everybody, and have a great week.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Amy. It's really been great having you.
Okay, thanks again.